Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We hope you're enjoying the day so far. Before we begin the last panel of the day, which will be a fantastic conversation with the nominees for the Producers Guild Award for Nonfiction Television, I'd like once again to thank our sponsors who help make events like this possible for our members. Of course, we couldn't do this at all without our presenting sponsor, The Hollywood Reporter. In addition, I'd like to thank Green Slate, Produce Iowa, General Motors, Honolulu Film Office, and Panavision and Light Iron for their support of this event. And now, I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for our next panel, the nominees for Outstanding Producer of Nonfiction Television, Jonathan Murray, the founder of Bunim Murray Productions. Jonathan and his late partner, Mary Ellis Bunim, are best known for creating MTV's genre-creating 1992 reality series, The Real World. Murray, who got his start in television news, has also executive produced the documentaries Autism, the musical, Valentine Road, They Call Us Monsters, and the recent Transhood. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan.
Thank you, Susan. I'm honored to be here to moderate this discussion with these PGA nominated producers who are gradually coming on the screen. Rebecca Chaiklin, she's the producer of Tiger King, Mayhem, and Madness, an exploration of big cat breeding and its bizarre underworld told over 7 episodes. Brian Lazarte, he's the producer of McMillions, a 6-part story of the investigation into the people who rigged the McDonald's Monopoly game promotion. Bill Owens is with us from 60 Minutes. It's the weekly news investigative journalism magazine that I think all of us grew up with. Among the topics they covered this year, Handcuffed to the Truth, a story about war crimes tied to Syria's Bashar al-Assad, and Justice Defenders, a segment about a nonprofit that gives legal training to inmates in Africa, and multiple segments on the coronavirus and its impact on the US and the world. Also with us is Ryan Suffern, producer, Laurel Canyon, A Place in Time, a 2-part exploration of the music and culture that came out of Laurel Canyon, the LA neighborhood that gave birth to the 60s and 70s eras defining music. Finally, Mike Tollin is with us. He's the producer of The Last Dance. It's the 10-episode documentary that tells the story of the Chicago Bulls dynasty led by Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman as they try to win their 6th NBA title. I'm going to start with Mike. I'm not a basketball watcher, but I was riveted to this. It was so good. And I'm wondering, what was your inspiration to tell this story? Were you concerned about people like me who were not big basketball watchers? And what were some of the big challenges you faced in telling it?
Well, first, thanks, John. It's great to be here, and it's lovely to hear that you were riveted. And I always ask people, well, if you weren't a basketball fan, then why were you riveted? But I'm not going to put you on the spot. We heard it a lot, and it was gratifying because, as all of us try to do always, we want to cast the broadest net, right? We want people who would never dream of watching a basketball game. And we heard it a lot from folks who said, I never could have imagined my kids or my wife or all of us getting together. One of the most gratifying things, of course, was bringing this out right in the teeth of the pandemic, right? It was right after the world kind of shut down on that Friday the 13th last March. We had a conference call the following Monday. Lots and lots of people in that kitchen. It was relatively crowded. ESPN and Netflix were our 2 platforms. There was Jump, which is Michael Jordan's company, and the NBA, and my team from Mandalay Sports Media, and Jason Hare, the director. And we were unanimous in our commitment to bringing this out as soon as possible to kind of fill the void. I mean, we were all stuck at home, particularly sports fans had nothing. The NBA had shut down, March Madness had been canceled, and so forth. And so we just felt like there was both an opportunity and a demand. And so what had been scheduled as a June 2nd release was now geared to launch on April 19th, which was 5 weeks away from the time we were having this conversation. So, talk about the challenges that a producer faces. All of a sudden, everything was being done remotely. Jason took his hard drive home, and as the director, he was also editing. And there were 5 editors all cutting independently in their homes scattered around Manhattan. It's that classic case of how long does it take to finish the job? As much time as you have, right? But to go back from the end to the beginning, what inspired me to jump into this project, it was kind of the holy grail. If you're a guy who traffics in sports media production, as I have by and large for what seems like 1,000 years, I go back to more than 20 years. We were doing an HBO show called Arliss about sports agents, and we had David Falk on, who at the time was Michael Jordan's agent. I'm talking 1999, the year after what was The Last Dance, the 97-98 season. And he said, he kind of whispered, the NBA shot this whole season, like chapter and verse, from the McDonald's All-Star game in France before the season started to the last shot when Michael Jordan hit that bucket over Brian Russell's head. It's amazing. There's 500 hours of footage. This is going to be the greatest show ever. And so began the quest. Many directors showing up along the way, from Spike Lee, who had obviously been close to Michael Jordan and done all those great Nike spots, to Frank Marshall, to Danny DeVito, and on and on and on. And the arrangement with the NBA was, if you let us shoot this footage, we won't ever distribute it or use it unless and until you agree. And it was up to Michael, and year after year they went to him, and year after year he said no. And so now we were getting almost up to the 20th anniversary. In 2016, I began the quest in earnest, and it only took 4 years. But we didn't quite make the 20th anniversary. We made it for 2 years later, but there were a lot of moving parts, and I'm sure we'll get to some of them in this ensuing hour. But it was just a question of, if we could get Michael, this would be, a program to remember, hopefully.
Thank you. Ryan, you also made a film that had to rely heavily on archival material, Laurel Canyon, A Place in Time. Can you tell us about what was your inspiration for that, and what were the challenges you perceived going into it?
Yeah, well, first of all, just on behalf of the whole producing team and my producing partner, Aaron Itikin, I just have to say, it's an honor to be acknowledged by the PGA and to be in the company of these other projects, many of which, have really helped us survive COVID, The Last Dance, and Tiger King especially. I'd say the inspiration, it started, my boss, Frank Marshall, and Michael Wright at the time was headed up Amblin, and they wanted to make a narrative TV show about Laurel Canyon. And, they were in development for quite some time, but it didn't come to pass. And at some point they pivoted and said, why don't we make a documentary about this? And that's when it kind of fell into my lap. And, having lived in, LA and in Studio City at the base of Laurel Canyon for many years, it became, an exploration of like, what is the history of this place? Because it is a bit of a myth of what is Laurel Canyon. I think the biggest challenge for us was there was this perception that that story had been told already, that there were other documentaries that had been in books, that had been in magazines, both from the audience point of view, but also from the artists. Like so many artists that we reached out to felt like they'd already participated in the Laurel Canyon, story. And yet we felt like there hadn't been the definitive telling that really wrapped together the whole of what was going on at that time. And a big part of why that hadn't been done, it was, the music at the heart of it. We're talking about some of the most successful, meaningful music of that time. And the challenge of being able to utilize that music to engage those artists was ultimately, I think, the biggest hurdle that we had to get over. And so we were able to put together a team between us with Amblin and Jigsaw and Warner Music to convince, everyone that we were going to tell the story in a way that hadn't been told before. And that was how we were not only going to be able to get access to the artists, but also be able to utilize the music to tell the story.
Bill, with 60 Minutes, you have to tell 100 stories a year. Curious, what is a 60-minute story? Like, what defines that when you look to make a decision on whether to tell a story? And how did Handcuffed to the Truth, your story about the war crimes of in Syria, tie into that?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with everybody. I've admired everybody's work on this panel. So congrats, everyone. As you said, we do 100 stories a year, and this year was, at one point I had to beg the network. We're a primetime show. We run from September through the end of May, like the rest of the primetime series. And that's what our budget is. But we were in the throes of both the pandemic and sort of racial strife that the country was dealing with in May. And so we were able to stay in production through July. So it's been a busy, challenging year. Like everybody here, 60 Minutes has been, it's been produced from here in Connecticut and people's kitchens in Manhattan and New Jersey. And so figuring out how to put together a show basically on the cloud was tricky. But to answer your question, what's a 60-minute story? Well, some of them are obvious and punch you right in the face. Obviously a COVID story. What we try to do on our best days is educate, have people take something away from the journalism, maybe clear something up, whether it's politics or medicine or what have you. We don't like to do stories about subjects or issues per se. We look for the story within those, a small story that helps people understand a broader topic. Syria, we began to cover in 2014. And it's not a story that gets a lot of coverage, unfortunately. And it's the biggest genocide of the past 3 decades, and it continues. Chemical weapons have been used hundreds of times on civilians. 250,000 civilians have been killed, 11 million people displaced, and it continues. So we've been covering this story once a year. It's a difficult story to cover, with the help of really brave Syrians. Sometimes it's been the White Helmets who won the Nobel Peace Prize, doctors, nurses, former military officials. And one story sort of led us to the next story. And Handcuffed to the Truth was, it's sort of the culmination of 7 years of work, wherein the evidence is being documented now and collected to attempt to bring Assad to justice when and if this civil war ever ends. So very, very difficult story to tell, gruesome images, the worst kind of atrocities that you can imagine, which is a difficult thing to then produce and to put on at 7 o'clock on a Sunday. In fact, the studio open of the piece started with, if you have children watching 60 Minutes tonight, that's usually a good thing, but this story is not for them. Obviously, parents can make up their own mind for what age it is appropriate, but we really needed to let people know that we were going to show the results of the genocide. So there you go.
Thanks. We'll get back to more on that, how you approached it. Brian, McMillion's the word I can't pronounce. What inspired you to tell that story, and what a rollicking story it was?
Thanks. Thanks, John. And it's a real honor to be a part of this panel with everyone here. So I appreciate all the kind words as well. I mean, out of the gate, the story is just, it's gripping. It's McDonald's, monopoly, fraud, FBI, undercover. You know, if you grew up in the 80s and the 90s, you remember playing this game. You remember getting to go and peel off a game piece with a large fry or Big Mac and having the chance to win $1 million. I mean, that just, there was no game at that time that did anything like that, no promotion. And so my producing and directing partner, James Lee Hernandez, he actually first came across the story back in 2012 on a Reddit post, funny enough. And he worked at McDonald's back in the 90s. And he was like, how did I not know about this? And like a lot of people, when you first hear that this entire campaign that happened from, you know, pretty much 1989 to 2001, where you could win the chance of a car, boat, or the $1 million prize by going to McDonald's and playing a Monopoly game, that you really never had a chance to win those high value prizes. Your mind is kind of blown instantly. It's like, wait a minute, how is that not possible? And we were, you know, very fortunate and to team up a good buddy, colleague, friend of mine, Archie Gips, his company, Unrealistic Ideas, which is Mark Wahlberg and Steve Levinson and Archie, teamed up with us, and we brought it to HBO. And just out of the gate, I mean, there was just so much momentum with the possibilities of where this could go. And we really, you know, we knew a fraction of the story at the time. You know, we had the FBI, we had a few of the winners. And one of the things that we learned early on was that this story was massive. You know, you've got the mob involved. The FBI went undercover, posing as a TV film crew to get people on camera. And there were, I mean, 53 people who were indicted across 23 states. And the fact that the story was such a huge story, but no one remembers it, also really boggled our mind. And the reason for that was because the whole thing happened, all the indictments and arrests happened literally days before 9/11. And so this story just got buried with, you know, something that was far more pressing to the American public. And we just, you know, we started down that path. HBO has been such an incredible network behind the project, the way we wanted to go about doing it, all the other producers. I mean, we had so many challenges along the way, you know, trying to get people to go on camera and, you know, to tell this incredible story. But it was just, I mean, we got sucked in out of the gate. And I hadn't personally had McDonald's in a number of years, but like by making this, like we were looking at the advertisements, we were talking to people. I know James and I, when we were out filming, we had our fair share of breakfast sandwiches and Big Macs and French fries, and but it was a lot of fun. You know, we've seen so often in the true crime genre stories that take us into really dark pasts, and you know, this was a story that had a great deal of levity just on the surface. You know, the idea of McDonald's, like McDonald's monopoly fraud. I mean, it's funny. And there weren't people, you know, killed, and it was just there was a fraud, there was a mystery, you know, behind it, but there was also relatability, and we always felt from the very beginning that folks who actually claimed these prizes and lied about claiming these prizes had a story to tell, and that we could all relate to them, and that was one of our great motivations for telling the story.
It was great. We'll talk more about it because I really I love the music, and I felt like I was watching a heist film. It was, you know, it really drew you in. Rebecca, talk about something that helped us get through the pandemic. Tiger King, Mayhem, and Madness. Wow. How did you get connected to this story? Your inspiration, challenges? You're muted, I think.
Oh, this is so weird. I don't know why my camera is doing that. I'm in a bad hotel room in Tampa, but I'm not in some weird, I don't know why that's happening, but I'll ignore it. So Tiger King was a story that we sort of, my partner, Eric, and I had stumbled into. I actually worked in college for Eric, who is a well-known, like super trendy restaurateur, nightclub proprietor, hotelier. And I worked at a nightclub with him and we became friends. And I knew he was sort of this closeted reptile person. And that part of his life didn't really fit with being in like downtown Manhattan in the like epicenter of nightlife. And then I was making documentaries and we kept in touch and we were friends. And he was like, I really want to take you down to Florida, where there's this crazy culture. And if you can imagine Breaking Bad, but instead of dealing meth, they're dealing exotic reptiles. And I was sort of like, that sounds interesting. And he was like, but we're never going to get access because they don't want anyone to know what's going on and they hate cameras and it's going to be impossible and it all happens in the shadows, but let's go on sort of a reconnaissance trip, which we did. And Eric had, he's changed and he now has dedicated his life to conservation. But at one time in his life, he was buying like all these exotic reptiles to put in nightclubs and all these various crazy art projects that he had. And so he knew some of the old school dealers, and we managed to get access to one of the most notorious people, one of the only people who had ever gone to prison for wildlife crimes at that point in this country for trafficking wildlife. And when we were there, sure enough, this guy whose thumb was hanging off because he'd just been bitten by a venomous snake drives up, and it was the middle of summer in south of Miami, probably 110 degrees, 100% humidity, and in the back of his van was a snow leopard. And that I just couldn't let that go. I was like, oh my God, we have to call the police. I knew, because I have a lot of family members who are naturalists, like how rare, there were only a couple thousand left on the planet. And they live in very high elevations where they have no immunity because they're always above in these very cold temperatures. And it was just the craziest thing to see this animal in the back of the van. And Eric was like, shh, be quiet, Rebecca. And it sort of set us on this journey, like, where did this cat come from? And it took us into a world that I knew absolutely nothing about. I had no idea that there was this whole exotic animal world in America, all these millions, tens of millions of people who keep exotic animals. And the ones that keep the apex predators tend to be very under the radar. And yet it was this really interesting dichotomy because they, as much as they wanted to stay in the shadows, they were the biggest group of narcissists that I've ever met in my life. And so they couldn't quite help themselves when a camera came around. They didn't want us around, but they kind of wanted to be on camera more than they wanted to stay out of jail. And so, which was allowed us some access. And the fact that Eric, not myself, everywhere we went, people were like, Peter, but Eric was very, very good. And he, coming from that world, was able to help talk us in and gain a level of trust where we got access to some of these places behind the scene and these characters in a way that I don't think people had seen much of before. And I certainly hadn't. It was this wild journey. And then we thought we were going to do a piece on this sort of epidemic of the fact that there were more tigers living in people's living rooms and backyards across the country than there were left in all the wild. Because we just started, we'd met Joe and he had 187 tigers that went up to 240 tigers and, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other animals. And he was such a crazy character. And then we met Carol and they were in this sort of crazy feud with each other, and they had switched places. Joe had started, he wanted to do a sanctuary and stop people from keeping these breeding and keeping these animals in captivity. And she had started as having the largest private collection, and they'd sort of traded places and along the way become completely obsessed with each other. And the craziest, most fatal attraction, but it was very tongue in cheek for us at first. We're like, isn't this crazy? This woman in Florida and this guy in Oklahoma who's this incredible character. He's like this Liberace-like character in the middle of the Bible Belt with 200 tigers and in polygamous relationships and, just very charismatic and doing lots of horrible things to the people and animals around him, but also incredibly charming and hard not to at least enjoy time around him, because he just had this a real zest for life. He was really sort of a unique character. And so we started filming thinking it was going to be about the animals, and very soon after that, the characters were they overshadowed the animals so quickly, because it just, I'd never seen anything like it. And then we just sort of kept rolling and things kept unfolding, and what we were making changed about 20 times, and then eventually we had a delivery date and we had to just stop.
Great. What you're really talking about is the discovery process in nonfiction filmmaking, I think, which is so exciting, because when you set off to tell a story, you don't always know where it's going to go or what you're going to find and how that's going to impact the way you tell the story. I'm curious, and now I'd just love it as if we could just have a discussion. So I'm wondering if any of you would like to talk about the discovery process and how it impacted the story you were telling, and what you might have found that changed your story or further led it in a direction.
I'll kick it off, John, just because you started with me. To a great extent, this was about the discovery of the real Michael Jordan. This is, iconic is a word that's often overused in sports and general entertainment, but I think it applies to Michael as much as anybody living or in the last century. And in the sports world, I kind of put Michael Jordan and Muhammad Ali and maybe Babe Ruth as the most iconic figures of the last century plus. And he managed to have everyone fall in love with him while he was playing, and somehow not really reveal his true self. He was the master at the interview where he'd smile and be cheeky and be charming, and the reporters would go away and go, wait, did he really answer our questions, or did he really tell us anything we didn't know? And so now, the mystique grows as he is in his post-playing career, and we know he's a businessman. He owns a team. His commercials continue. Incredibly, his Nike sales increased by tenfold in the 2 decades after he was playing. So the idolatry continued and multiplied. And so, for me, figuratively and literally getting behind the curtain was the biggest task, and the one that would be instrumental in moving forward. And so ultimately I had to go through about a 6-month courtship, chaperoned by Esty Portnoy and Curtis Polk, who were Michael's business managers, attorneys, partners, really. And they identified the opportunity, shared my enthusiasm to some extent, but were skeptical and protective. And it really took from February of 2016, when we met in Toronto at the All-Star game, till June of that year, till I was given an invitation, which led to a red eye for a meeting that wasn't scheduled, and hoped for a chance to, again, peek behind the curtain and actually get to meet Michael. So, producers, stock and trade is research and preparation, right? We all need to be prepared for the big moment. So I sat around and waited, and ultimately Michael was kind of captive because they were preparing for the NBA draft that was happening the next day. They were waiting for the opportunity, and he was free, a little bit reluctant and unsure of what this meeting was going to be about, but all right, bring him in, and, I'll have a few minutes to make my case. And I gave him this lookbook, never knowing if I'd actually get to give it to him in person, never knowing if he'd read it. And he sat down, shook my hand, very gracious. Immediately, you see the charm and charisma. And he says, oh, wow, that's a lot of words in there. Wait, let me get my reading glasses. And it was kind of like, wait, Superman needs reading glasses. That's a disconnect. But he sat there and read this note in which I said, every day people come to my office wearing your shoes who've never seen you play. It's time. And so I'm making a pitch kind of based on legacy. Who knew if that mattered to him? But again, as producers, we know that if you compile enough no's and keep going at it, eventually maybe the magic will transpire and you'll get a yes. And I just think at the age of 53 with a new family and nearly 2 decades from having been a player, he was in a place to be more reflective, more candid, have a perspective about his career, and just really open to the possibility of telling his story. And the discovery in actually making the film with Jason Hare, who was the extremely talented director who prepared all the interviews and really put this thing together, tender loving care, all the nuts and bolts through it all. The interviews revealed this fire that we all kind of assumed but never had heard articulated, where at the end of episode 7, and maybe the most memorable couple minutes of the 10 episodes, Michael breaks down in talking about how his competitiveness had led to difficulties and often estrangements with teammates and people in his life. And he says, all I wanted to do was be the best basketball player I could be. All I ever asked of all of my teammates was no more than what I asked of myself. And he leans forward with tears appearing in his eyes and says, break. And you saw how emotional he was. And you realized this man, his version of greatness was take no prisoners, leave no stone unturned. And obviously it led to 6 titles and his being, considered the GOAT by most of us. And we remain hugely grateful for how candid and open and trusting he was with us.
Brian, you must have had, in telling McMillions, you must have had, I wish you'd change the title. You must have just kept discovering things. I'm assuming you didn't have all the answers going in. And so you were constantly sort of reconfiguring what this story was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, out of the gate, James and I always wanted to tell the story first from the FBI's point of view. So we kind of had this idea of flipping the point of view as the series went on from, being this FBI procedural. And we were very fascinated by this inner world of creative decision-making and tactics that you don't really get to see too often. I mean, even in other FBI stories and even police procedurals. So we were really fascinated by starting with that and then flipping that and starting to hear from, the quote unquote winner's perspective as the series evolved. And out of the gate, we didn't, you're 100% right. We didn't know if McDonald's would want to be a part of this, if they wouldn't participate. And, just like Mike, I mean, when we were first reaching out to some of these winners who were federal criminals, they said no. and eventually, you get enough no's, or if enough people say, well, I'll still talk to you on the phone, it's just, you kind of go through that effort of trying to explain to people what you're trying to do. Because on the surface, this was one of the worst things that happened to in their life. And by 9/11 erasing it, they felt like they've kind of avoided having to talk about it in public. And we were asking them to expose something that was very vulnerable to them. And James and I flew all over the country. We met with people in person without even knowing if they'd ever agree to go on camera, and that included McDonald's. And we just asked them to think about how telling their story, having their perspective be told, would actually be of greater value, because we had the FBI's point of view. And if we only told the FBI's point of view in the story, it would really skew a relatability that we felt like we would earn by learning and talking to all the subjects that were part of it, and that became federal criminals. And of course, out of the gate, we actually wrote out, we put on paper, how the series was going to unfold. One of the things that we weren't entirely sure of was just how big it was and how many episodes it could be. It kept fluctuating all the time. And eventually we got to the point where we're like, okay, we don't want to milk this. This is we could probably go more episodes, but if we really jam pack it in, to these 6 episodes, we could tell this incredible arc of a story and flip that point of view and surprise people along the way. And as we were filming and learning about these other characters, eventually McDonald's did come on board, and that was a big thing for us. I mean, that took us, probably I think 18 months or so of efforts and phone calls and emails and in-person conversations. But there was turnover. I think there was people, like we got to a point where we were okay, and then someone else took over the position of making that decision, and we were like, oh, we're back to square one. But you just keep working at it, and ultimately our goal was to be extremely transparent with everybody. When we spoke with McDonald's, here's what we want to do, here's how we want to go about doing it, here's why we think it would be great for you to participate. And likewise for all the federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and whatnot. And then, the biggest discovery for us was, who was the informant? Who actually was the person who actually called into the FBI and tipped off the FBI? Because we were told that had this informant never tipped off the FBI, this crime would have kept going on probably till this day. And we were literally like on that hunt. We started asking these questions like, well, do you know who the informant was? And what's not in the series is a lot of people had very unique theories as to who the informant was. And some of them were very convincing. And James and I were always just like thinking, gosh, I mean, that sounds really believable. And it sent us down a path, but eventually when we actually discovered who the real informant was, it was actually immediate in that moment. We were like, that this is our ending. And then if you haven't seen the ending, we don't want to ruin it, but the son of the person who tells us who the informant was comes in the most surprising way. And we were just like this, like, it's hard to hold back when you're behind the camera, just how ridiculous and absurd like those random and special moments are that you can capture on camera.
Those great gifts you get as a producer, those little just wonderful gifts that come your way. Ryan, wow, with Laurel Canyon, you're somewhat tied to what archival footage you have. You also are trying to get new interviews, and then there's always the potential that some people won't agree to be interviewed. I can imagine you were trying to get people to agree to interviews right through the whole process.
No, absolutely. I think from the outset with our director, Allison Elwood, we decided we were going to do this as audio only interviews. And so, the great aspect of that, and we've done that on a couple other documentaries, Johnny Cash and Frank Sinatra, it's great to get the buy-in from the participants, especially, rock stars or singer-songwriters or people who've been so, publicized with their image, who are very aware of what they look like. And if you're talking to people 50 years removed from the story that you're telling, they're even more aware of it. So we had doing audio only interviews we had a great batting average, let's say. I think we got 24-ish out of 26 maybe of the folks that we wanted to talk to, because there wasn't that concern about how do we look on camera. And it's so much easier, and it's a great device to create a conversation with your subject, when all it is a microphone hanging above you, and you can kind of forget the artifice of all of the cameras and lights and everything else that is usually involved with doing an interview. So, we were very fortunate in that, using that device, we were able to get so many more folks to participate, but we were also able to incorporate the voices of those who didn't participate and those who weren't with us anymore, so we could have, Joni Mitchell, who's had health issues, who's still with us, but wasn't going to be able to do an interview, alongside, Mama Cass Elliott, who isn't with us, and Jim Morrison and Neil Young, and, and all of the other folks that did do interviews with us. So the audio interview device really served us, but it also presents a challenge, because you can't just cut to the interview ever. You can't cut to that person on camera just talking. So you have to paint the picture the entire time with the visual language of what are we seeing whilst these people are talking. So it's a sword that cuts both ways. It allows us to incorporate archive interviews of folks, both past and present, but we have to figure out how are we going to visually tell the story without, being able to ever cut to the person who's talking. It's only going to be a lower third chyron, that identifies who's talking. And so, it was an incredible exercise, but it did allow us to get, the buy-in from so many folks that I think it would have been incredibly difficult to actually get them to participate otherwise, if we had to go and shoot them all on camera.
Bill, in Handcuffed to the Truth, you actually had to protect the identity of two of your interview subjects, and I think one of them, the photographer, you called Caesar. Did that story, I know you've been covering it for 7 years, but did that story sort of start with trying to get him to make those pictures available to you, and then get him on camera? What was sort of, tell me a little about that.
Yeah. Short answer is yes. We were told that there was a former military intelligence officer who had been taking pictures of all of these atrocities, and through a subject and then a source, there was a meeting. We also had to verify the metadata that he said he had been collecting, making sure that the times and places that he said, this is what the aftermath of the sarin gas attack looked like. Here's the school where 180 parents were lined up. And so we had to work with the FBI and also international relief agencies to make sure that everything that he was sharing with us was what he said it was. Interestingly, we found out from some of the people we had been working with in Syria who have since been exiled, that Caesar is known in Syria now almost like kind of a Desmond Tutu, he's going to be a historical figure after the Civil War is over. One of the bravest people who has taken on the dictatorship. So we had to do all of those things. And one of the nice things that happened out of all of this is the name of the group is the Syrian Emergency Task Force. After our story aired, a lot of donations came in, and that money goes to just humanitarian efforts as a result of all the damage that's been done. It's a drag that I can only talk about this story, though, I have to say.
I know.
It's everybody has something that's a little bit lighter, and I couldn't be any more proud of this work. Yeah, we have we do a wide variety of stories every year, and a lot of them are depressing, but sometimes we get to tell a fun story too.
I think they're incredibly important stories, and the fact that you're covering Africa the way you are is important. So thank you. Rebecca, what was your approach to interviews, and as you went through this, Did you go in with a certain idea of how you were going to get your interviews and what the settings would be for them?
No, I mean, and I'm sorry, I realized my son, I think, set this crazy background that I don't know how to get off my computer, but at least I'm not a cat. So, and I'm traveling, so I don't have it. But we were very, I would say we really tried to just be as real as possible and not like, I know people find this hard to believe, but actually just film things organically, the way that people wanted to dress in the places that they lived or wherever they were in that moment. We tried to just make it as real, even if it was really ugly and we were straight up against like, a panel wooden wall, or whatever it may be, on a bed filled with stuffed animals. We were like, don't move anything. We're just going to work within real space. And I think part of it was this was such a unique sort of subculture that we felt we had stumbled into, and people were so eccentric and their spaces said so much about who they were that we just felt like to try and light and create a frame didn't make sense for this particular.
I have a question for Rebecca. Was it because you had a camera in hand that people kind of opened up? Because there were several interviews I was so surprised that people actually talked to you, especially the guy who was like the ringleader of, I can't remember what his name was at this point now, because it's been almost a year since I've seen it, but like the guy who was the, God, was it Southern Florida? I think
Mario?
Yeah, Mario. Like this guy, like, why did he let you in? Was it because you had cameras and he liked being on camera?
No, he was the one person who actually really didn't want to be on camera. And it took a lot. I mean, we couldn't even get on his property initially. And then we got on his property and eventually we just talked to him. And actually he was quite, a lot of these people who keep these big cats their entire lives, they can't ever go anywhere because it takes so much time and energy, and the cats are so dangerous and you can't leave anybody with them. And so they all sort of like create their own little kingdoms, but they also get quite lonely. And I really actually liked Mario, as crazy as his past was. And he was the one person who really didn't want to be on camera, but I think it became incredibly cathartic. And we didn't go, we could have made a whole film just about him because he really took us on this insane story. And it was the first time he'd ever told the story of like how he had run this cartel out of South Florida and Louisiana, and how he had all the cops and the Coast Guard on his payroll. And it was just a wild, wild story. His dad was in the Bay of Pigs. He was a CIA informant. That's why part of the reason he got out of jail was that he had all these CIA connections through his family and trying to overthrow Castro. And it was very divergent, but it was absolutely a film, if not maybe, a couple episodes in and of itself, but a totally different story.
Cool.
But he was tricky. It took us months to get in with him. And I think it was ultimately as he opened up a little, and Eric would say like, you can't believe the amount of drugs I've done in my lifetime. And I had nightclubs and, and I was like, and I worked in nightclubs and there's nothing that will surprise us. And we'd bring pictures and, like the craziest. And it was funny, like sometimes we bring, stuff in and he'd be like, I hate that shit. I don't want any of that gay shit on my stuff. Like, I'm not into that. You guys are weird. And then other things he'd be really into. And slowly he warmed up. And then I think it became incredibly cathartic because he had never told the story before. And we couldn't stop him from talking. It was just crazy. He would tell us the most graphic details of this. I mean, he really is, obviously Scarface was loosely based on him, but he is a documentary in and of himself.
Great.
Awesome.
We have about 10 minutes left, everybody. Brian, I do have to ask you about the music in McMillions. did the editors just start using temp music that was sort of from heist films, or was that how did that happen? And did a composer come in and do it?
Yeah, so Pinar Toprek was our composer for the series, and she was awesome from the get-go. She did Captain Marvel. I think this was one of her first documentary projects she had ever done. And both James and I have a background in editorial. We've spent many years of our career as editors. And so we were always, thinking about music as we were building the series. And we had a couple great editors as well, that as we were encouraging them to play with, this certain tone and these vibes that, lived in that heisty space, but also punchy space. It had, either horns or we wanted it to be fun and funny along the way. But we also knew that the series overall would have, these great undertones of moral ambiguity, that would sort of make you question whether or not this was a real victimless crime, and, all the people that were hurt. So we would tempt some things just to get a clear idea of like, okay, could this work? Because we actually hadn't seen that done in other documentaries or documentary series before, at least not on the surface, that we could say, hey, it's like this other film that we could compare it to. So it was a bit of experimentation. But the moment Pinar came on, she really embraced it. She had so much fun with it. I mean, the opening title track for the opening titles, we didn't have anything for that. We actually didn't. We kind of went the opposite direction of how we built title sequences in past projects, which is we asked her to score something for us based on a lookbook and visuals that we wanted to explore for the title sequence. And it was a pure, like, just try it, I think we kind of gave her this, it's part Pink Panther, part Thomas Crown Affair or something like that. It was, I can't remember what the combination was that we pitched her. And no joke, I mean, she came back pretty much with what we ended up using. I mean, out of the gate, we were just like, we loved it. We loved the vibe. And then we turned that over to another friend, animator, an editor, who helped us build out the title sequence. And it was just like, we built that from the music, which is usually, we kind of would work the other way around. And it was awesome. We can't say enough great things about Pinar.
Mike, did you bring a composer in? What was your approach to the music?
Yeah, we did. We, from the beginning, decided we would have a composer as well as what we call needle drops. Thomas Caffey was the composer. He had worked with Jason Hare, the director, previously. I give him enormous credit for being adaptable, flexible, malleable, patient. There are a lot of chefs in the kitchen, as I said previously, and as we kind of know, there's nothing more subjective than music, and it's such easy pickings to say, this is too dramatic or too ominous, or we need more life here, or like we need something a little more emotional there. Thomas just stayed at it and did endless takes and got something that we were all delighted with. And Jason Hare is very musical in his approach and had very clear ideas about wanting to put us in the times in the 90s, 80s. Michael was a rookie in 84 with the Bulls. So it's 80s and 90s primarily. We had a great music supervisor named Rudy Chung. We budgeted for somewhere between 2 and 3 tunes per show. As any of us who have done this, it's very expensive to license, especially when they know it's a high profile show. We kind of tried to do most favored nation deals, and sometimes it worked and didn't always. But I think we ended up with 29 cuts, so almost 3 per show. And the music really took on a life of its own. I mean, it was pretty eclectic, from Naughty by Nature to Nas and Lauryn Hill and Biggie Smalls and Puff Daddy and Coolio. And then for the final song that took us out of the final episode, Jason, I'll never forget, I walked into the edit room one day and he said, I think I have the tune here, listen. It's a tune called Present Tense by Pearl Jam, and Eddie Vedder was a big Bulls fan. It was always at the Bulls game. So there was that connection. And it just, it's still available, so you can go check it out, but it just felt like the perfect tone. There was, sort of melodrama, and it was bittersweet, sweet. And at the end of the day, there were like big stories about the music in the New York Times, and ultimately Spotify put its own playlist together. They took our songs and added another couple dozen, and I think it's probably still available on Spotify. You can get like the Last Dance playlist and all the music that we used, plus another several dozen cuts.
Ryan, you obviously had the incredible music of all these 60s and 70s groups, but you also had some composed music, didn't you, for some transitions or not?
No, absolutely. And not to throw shade on Mike, but I think we had 100 needle drops in our 2 episodes.
Impressive.
But yeah, but also I think we had close to 3 dozen, original composed pieces from our composer, Paul Pilot, because there was so much different music that the compositions from the composer was one of the ways to cohesively connect all this stuff, so that we could thematically tell this story. And so it's amazing for all of the music that we had from the Laurel Canyon artists. We have a ton of original music to help be the glue to kind of to stick it all together from our composer, which ultimately made it feel like a cohesive piece.
Right. And Rebecca, what was your approach to music or soundtrack?
It was pretty eclectic. We ended up working with Mark Mothersberg, who was amazing and saved us because he helped make the series was sprawling in so many different directions, and we had so many different characters. And I think we came to him so late in the game, and his team was just, and we, initially I wanted to work with somebody who was in New York where our whole edit team was. And then we realized like, wow, this is really big. And we need a whole team because we have very little time before we have to finish. And so they were just incredible. They worked around the clock. They did, thousands of revisions. I think I drove them completely insane. But we really wanted to have, we knew that this was a fun theme, story. And so we wanted to have fun with the music, and it sort of had a tongue-in-cheek, waiting for Guffman, Grizzly Man feel to it. And he was so great at helping execute that.
Bill, real quickly, I come out of journalism originally. I know generally you don't add a soundtrack or music. So what's your approach when you're trying to sort of add something to a story?
There's nothing better than the stopwatch. Makes everybody stop in their tracks, and most all of our parents yelled, "Shut up, 60 Minutes is on" at 7 o'clock when the stopwatch came on. But actually, you know what? We enjoy doing profiles of musicians. As a kid, I learned a lot about music through 60 Minutes, and we continue to try to do that. We don't use music as sort of an effect. There has to be a reason, a performance, something along those lines. But we always look forward to working with up and coming artists who have a good story to tell. In fact, last weekend we did the St. Augustine band from New Orleans, which is a super famous marching band that is just starting to sort of practice. I think it's in the 7th Ward, just kind of marching around the neighborhood, and people are coming out on their porches to hear the music again in New Orleans because there was no Mardi Gras again this year. So that was a fun one to do, to tell that story.
Well, I can't believe it, but our hour has come to an end. I really want to thank all of you for your work, for helping to get us through COVID with your work. And it was just such a pleasure to talk to you all. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Much.
Everyone.
And now it's my pleasure to throw back to PGA National Executive Director, Susan Sprung.
Well, that's the end of our program. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see all of you in person at this event next year. Many thanks again to The Hollywood Reporter and all of our fantastic sponsors.